Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Scott Phillips, IDL's Policy and Communications Chief. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the third and final installment of our Payette Endowment Lands Strategy Focus Group. On behalf of the Department of Lands and the Land Board, I wish to thank the panelists for their time and their commitment, their energy and their ideas. We appreciate what you're doing to help us. And for the citizens who have tuned into this event, we appreciate their interest as well. As a matter of housekeeping, if you're not speaking, will you please mute your line through Zoom? The focus group attendees will have access to open access to questions. Other citizens who have tuned in will be in listen-only mode. We'll handle questions today as we've done in the past. You're welcome to speak up and ask your question, submit it via the Zoom chat feature. You can simply say in Zoom chat that you have a question, I'll call on you. We've got a lot of folks on the line today. I'll do my best to manage all the questions well. But if you see me get out of order, I'd appreciate your help staying on track and let me know that I missed someone and I'll call on them. Like past meetings, we'd appreciate very much if you'd please not let your questions roam into areas of interpretation of law or legal advice. We'll begin this afternoon by a quick recap of our first two meetings. During the January 28th meeting, we covered a great deal of background information about endowment land, specific to the legal framework under which the board and the department operate. We also delved into how Idaho acquired endowment land through the Congressional Admissions Bill, and how the Idaho Constitution requires land board members to act with undivided loyalty to secure the maximum long-term financial return for the trust beneficiaries. Speaking of undivided loyalty, what that means is that while the land board can listen to ideas and suggestions from outside interests, at the end of the day, when they make decisions, they're operating as fiduciaries, operating under a constitutional mandate, and they must make sure the endowment beneficiaries are put first, above all other interests. And they have broad decision-making authority that they and they alone must exercise. On February 11th, we heard from both the City of McCall and Valley County speaking about community vision and their long-term land use plans. Chris Anton, our manager of investments for the Endowment Fund Investment Board, shared with us information about this notion of whole trust and how the land assets and the financial assets are managed in concert with one another to the benefit of today's beneficiaries and tomorrow's. For today's agenda, which is our final meeting, since I've already recapped our first two meetings, we'll begin with agenda item A. And for this section of the agenda, we'll devote 1 hour to a question and answer period. This is really your opportunity to ask the questions that we couldn't get to due to time constraints at our last meeting, and to ask any new questions that have popped into your mind as you've thought about the PELS plan for the past 2 weeks. Under agenda item B, we'll discuss the plan itself. However, the format of this section or portion of our agenda will be a little bit different than we've done in the past. Rather than an open forum, I'll call on each participant in the order that you are listed under the attendees portion of the agenda and ask you to tell us what the plan's missing, what should be changed, share your insights about implementing the plan, and if you see any good things in the plan, we'd appreciate hearing what they are. You'll each have up to 5 minutes to share your thoughts during this portion of the agenda. And again, your turn to speak will follow the order listed under the attendees section of the top of our meeting agenda. Now, one of my favorite parts of any meeting is the break. We've got a long 3-hour stretch a day with lots of Q&A and discussions. So rather than putting the break in a hard spot between items on the agenda, when we get close to 2:30, we'll break for 15 minutes, and then we'll resume, which will be somewhere in the middle of agenda item B. The last two items on the agenda probably won't take very much time. We'll cover the process through which you may submit your comments, suggestions, and ideas about the Payette Endowment Land Strategy to the Land Board on agenda item C. And the final item, agenda D, will explain how the plan will be presented to the Land Board in March. So that kind of gets us ready to start with the big meat and potatoes of the day. So what I'd like to do is just open up the forum to questions, and we'll direct them to IDL staff, or I'll try to field them if I'm able, and we'll do our best to answer the questions you may have. I'm watching the chat and I don't see any questions coming in yet.
Scott, can I ask you to just stop sharing your screen so I can see my whole screen? I'm struggling bringing up some content.
I'll have Tammy do that. I'm actually not sharing, so. Tammy, could you please take down the agenda for just a moment? Thanks. You guys aren't going to let us off this easy, are you?
I thought you were going to wait and go through each of the members.
Jonathan, this first portion will be like we've done in the past, where just open forum, you have questions, we're going to answer them. The second portion will be when we call on you individually. So for agenda item A, it's open forum, free game, ask away, please.
Well, I've got one, unless someone else has a really burning question.
Go ahead.
So this relates to some of the discussion that we had at our last meeting, and that had to do with the classification of lands and the timberland asset classification, and just again trying to get at kind of the notion of a recreational classification, and you know, during that response, if I'm remembering correctly, I think it was Bill Hoganson was talking a little bit about how some of the lands around Tamarack were, you know, potentially classified as recreation purpose. But, you know, my understanding is that those still, you know, hold a timberland classification. And so that they really would, you know, kind of have a, you know, well, I guess just the question of how that revenue gap is filled on timberlands that don't have an active timber program, and, you know, whether or not there is a potential to look at a recreational asset classification. And then also just how those changes are made. Again, it's an area, it's a kind of a big gray area for me in terms of how that shift is made, and if that's done by the land board during their consideration of the asset plan or through some other means.
Jim, would you please field this question for Jonathan?
I'll try, and Bill can fill in behind me. So as we explained last time, recreation is an activity because it can coincide with multiple land management uses, regardless if it's timber, ag, or grazing, or any of our other classifications that we have in general. So with the Tamarack thing, yep, that's probably the highest breadwinner for what's going on there, but it does not preclude us from continuing to do timber management. So even if, in my mind, even if we had a recreation lease that was paying us much more on the land value than timber might bring in, there is still a resource that needs to be managed. You cannot just walk away from it and not do some sort of management. Now, would we treat it exactly the same as timberland that's primary? Probably not, but we still have to manage for fire safety, fuels, and insect and disease issues.
And then the second part of that was how are those classifications managed? I mean, how does it shift from timberland to transition? Is there a formal process that lands go through, or is that kind of behind the proverbial?
Well, they're transition lands are transition. We don't say that they're not necessarily classified as that. We just recognize that they may have a different use, and so that they're under identification. My understanding is that we would look at what the best use of that land is going forward, and we would work with the land board to make that classification change.
Within our chat appliance, Kristen Sinclair had a question with confusion about whether we're going to have 3 or 4 meetings. We are going to have 3 meetings. The land board will be meeting on March 16th. The comment period will close on March 1st. And that will give us time to incorporate everyone's comments and ideas and suggestions into the plan and get our package and do our prep work to bring it to the land board. Go ahead, Julie.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon. As a follow-up to what you just said, I'm just wanting to clarify, how will the focus group's comments be used? And When are they due? Is that what you contemplate hearing in sort of the second half of this meeting, or is it in a fourth meeting, or how is this going to happen?
So we'll cover that under agenda items C and D.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I feel like the teacher on Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Anyone?
I think Nick Harris has a question. At least he had his hand up.
Nick, please.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thanks again for this opportunity, by the way. This is great. This sort of collaboration, I think, is to be lauded as an example. So just I kind of drilling down into what Jonathan said, and I'm trying to tie this in with a question that I asked last period, but we have these essentially 3 classifications of land. And I'm trying to understand that in the context of, obviously there's a constitutional mandate to achieve the highest long-term return that the board is held to, a very difficult thing to navigate. And I just kind of think back to what my experience is, which is in investments. And when I look at investments, probably the biggest portion of any return of an asset is how much it appreciates, right? And that's true whether it's, a stock, less true of a bond, actually not true of a bond, but, certainly with stocks, with commodities and things like that, a big part of the total return is the appreciation. So I'm just trying to understand, how that fits within the confines of how you categorize the land and how much flexibility there is with that. Does that make sense? Because it sounded like in the response to last week that yes, the appreciation of land value is a part of the consideration, but it seemed to be minimized. So I'm just trying to understand that.
Let's see, Jim.
Well, I'm not going to try to remember what Bill said, so I'm going to punt.
No, happy to take that one, Scott. And appreciation is obviously an important part of land ownership. I mean, we all see it in our homes and other assets that folks own, and certainly true for endowment lands as well. The question that where it becomes an issue for the endowments, as we've discussed before, is the ability to at some point capture that appreciation. Because without that ability, is there value to the endowments in an asset that appreciates that could never be sold, right? Like a stock that you would never sell. So that's where things are, where we are different than an industrial forest landowner who would track their returns based on appreciation and income. Income is the driver as far as our ownership of timberlands and our calculation of returns. That said, if holding a parcel and allowing it to appreciate while still producing a sufficient amount of revenue, if that strategy made sense on a parcel by parcel basis, that's certainly an approach that could make sense for the board in terms of their evaluation of a parcel, whether to hold it or sell it. We would look at all those factors when we're making a recommendation as to the future status of that parcel for the endowments. I hope that made sense, Nick. It's a consideration, but in timberland, because we can't sell timberland, we can't really capture that appreciation.
Yeah, I get it. And that's because it's classified as timberland, right?
Yep.
So, and this, I'll refrain really from commenting because it'll come later, but I think, a solution is to have an asset class that allows for a plethora of uses that generates yield and helps you to realize that monetary value that keeps going up with appreciation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I do hear what you're saying. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
And I'd follow up with that. I guess, everybody keeps throwing out recreation, but if we're doing recreational leases in nature, in my mind, that comes across as a commercial lease. So that would be, then we could say, okay, yeah, we can classify this land as commercial land, not necessarily recreation. But there's a can of worms there too, because there's we have other agreements with other agencies that allow for public access on our grounds, but we can't even, an exclusive use type lease that's going to take some major consideration given other agreements that we have. So I just would throw that out there for you guys to consider is, you know, we're trying to be multiple use without being multiple use like the Forest Service explains it. We have to have a primary economic driver.
Thank you. Dave Bingaman had a question in the chat appliance. We've all talked about her suggestions that we should allow the focus group to evolve into an advisory group with a longer lifespan. This would allow input on tier 2 and 3 lands or future transitional lands in the area, as well as input on disposition and leasing actions. With that in mind, is there any interest from IDL to take a recommendation forward to the land board? IDL really is the administrative arm of the board. We are the instrumentation by which they do their work. Our directive on this was to gain public input on the PELS plan, what we wanted to propose, and to kind of mine you guys for some good ideas and get some community buy-in and hopefully learn from you and help you learn from us. With that said, you're welcome to include those in your comments, but I don't believe IDL will be making that recommendation. I'm watching for hands. I'm looking for chat. Annette, did you have something?
I'm trying to type it in the chat as fast as I can. I'm almost done.
You're welcome just to talk if you'd like.
Well, I was wondering, and I apologize, I don't have the plan up on my screen right now, but can IDL include in the description of the parcels the date that the trust acquired those lands? I mean, I think my basic assumption was they all came at the same time with the constitutional establishment, but I'm wondering if any of them were acquired in later years through exchanges or purchases or whatever, and whether that makes any difference or not.
Thanks, Annette. Scott, I see that you've turned your camera on in anticipation of me calling on you.
Yes. The lands around Payette Lake mostly were what they call in lieu lands. So during at statehood, when the government granted those lands to the state of Idaho, if there was a section 16 or 36, the original sections given to the state of Idaho, if there was a homestead, cities or something like that, they would let us choose different grounds in lieu of that section 16 or 36. Much of that on the lakefront were in lieu. But over the past late 80s and through the 90s, we had 5 exchanges. We did many exchanges with the Forest Service to acquire many of the upland lands around there, up around Bear Basin, some on the north tip, on the east side. So it's a mix, but they're in lieu lands on the lakefront basically, and in the uplands were traded with Forest Service, and we traded them a lot of wilderness parcels in those exchanges. And that's also how we acquired our large block over west of Council as well.
And Scott, let me just add too, this is Ryan, that we have updated the PELS plan on the IDL website to include an appendix. So appendix 2 of that plan now has the transition lands parcel history that goes through each parcel identified and then the transaction on which it was occurred.
Thanks, Scott and Ryan. Jennifer, you had a question.
Yeah, and I have to reiterate what other people have said. Thank you very much for inviting us to this opportunity. And you know, my background, I'm with the Forest Service, which is, I understand, totally a completely different thing. But after sitting on these calls and hearing the interest in recreation and understanding that IDL has a different mission, but one of the things that I know in the Forest Service that we do sometimes is do prospectuses. So if somebody is interested in doing some sort of recreation opportunity, and I was just wondering, is there an opportunity, or is there a way that IDL could do something like that to kind of to ensure that there is you're making the money that is required for those lands. And I mean, in particular, I think of some of the ski areas, adjacency, the little ski hill, Brundage, things like that, where there could be some sort of lease or even just other opportunities. And like I said, I know we're totally different organizations, but I didn't know, based on what you were saying before, Jim, and the commercial aspect, are there those opportunities that can capitalize on the recreation that seems to be so important?
Jennifer, that's a fantastic question, getting at how does one do business with IDL? Ryan, if you're still available, could you please field that one for us?
Sure. So we've talked about TAMRAC previously, and it would be a similar situation. So if there is an interest by a private organization to bring forth some sort of application regarding recreation, we are all for that. So any type of recreation where we can drive income is more than welcomed.
Ryan, what's the first step someone should take to do business with IDL?
So on our website, we have the different leasing applications and classifications. So typically what will happen is someone would go to the area office, talk with the area staff about the proposed use. There are certain situations where there may be a conflict of use. So for example, if there's a parcel that has a cabin site and someone wants to recreate on that, that'd be a conflicted use that it's not compatible. But if, for example, the property is available for lease and it's not conflicted use, then we would go through the application process, which means that we'll start to look at what you're looking for, the type of lease it is, and go through that application. You'd submit an application, and then from there we would go through the application process, which depends on what type of lease you're looking at. So some of the leases are in the rules, and some of those are just in statute. So we'd go through the process just depending on what you're looking for.
Thanks, Ryan. And so I see Scott Corkle on my screen down near the bottom of my screen, at least. He's going to be probably the first point of contact for you at the McCall area office. Jonathan, you've been waiting patiently with a question. The floor is yours, sir.
Yeah, just one question. There was some discussion about, kind of continuing the focus group or I get the sense, I understand where IDL is in terms of you guys have to prepare for the March 16th land board meeting, and that having us floating around out there, is a challenge. And I guess I would just make the point that, recognizing that a number of these lands did come in as in lieu lands, and so were purchased sometime after 1890. Some of these other lands have been in state ownership for over 131 years. And it just seems to me that trying to rush through to a decision in the next, what is it? I mean, not counting tomorrow, we're, March 1st, basically 2 weeks from that land board meeting. Understand that you need to make a presentation to them, but I just strongly feel, and I can't speak for other members of the group, but I think that there is a chance that this group could come together with consensus, or at least a significant majority of consensus, with some recommendations to the land board that could help navigate these issues, and that kind of artificially putting a halt to these, what I feel have been productive discussions, is selling the group short, and is frankly is also selling the land board short in terms of what the potential is for this group, I think, to really help resolve and come up with some, I think, long-term win-win solutions with regards to these lands that recognizes that duty of the land board. And so I don't know if there's a time on this, on the agenda, or if we can, and I don't want to, throw a grenade under the table here, but I really do think that we could just quickly get a show of hands of focus group members and say, yeah, we think that we could come together with a position that could be useful to both the department and the board as they continue to mull over these decisions that, again, are going to be the template for the remaining 2.5 million acres of the endowment lands across the state. So if we get it wrong here, we're going to have a lot of digging to do to address that. So that's...
Jonathan, I respect what you're saying, and I understand where you're coming from. However, I would be very remiss if I didn't point out that from the very beginning of this process, IDL did not intend it to be driven by parcel-specific discussions. And that's what I hear you mentioning when you say these.
No, nothing about parcels.
May I please finish, Jonathan?
Yeah.
May I please finish? Rather, our intention is to build this framework by which we can evaluate opportunities for transactions and what to do with land. That said, we believe that this process that we've designed and how we're going through is going to give us the feedback and information that we need to take to the board to look for more direction from the board. Like I said earlier, you're welcome to express those in the comments that you submit for the board review. And I'm certain that the board is going to look very closely at every piece of feedback, particularly from the comments from this group, because they charged us to bring you together so they could listen to you.
Scott?
Just for clarification, I never intended that we go through a parcel by parcel. I mean, I think that at some point that may make sense, but I think just looking at the whole of the proposal, looking at its impacts and its implications for both Payette Lake and those communities, as well as the endowment, and then also thinking about how this is applied more broadly. I just think that these are bigger decisions that are going to take more time, and we shouldn't be trying to box it in effectively.
Right. All right, Brad has a question, please. Brad, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, and I also want to echo the thoughts of bringing folks together and soliciting comment. Appreciate it very much. This word in lieu brought up a question, is that an entity interested in applying for use of a specific parcel, can they include stewardship activities in addition to just a pure rental payment? Stewardship activities could be not just weed control, could be enforcement, could be fire protection, could be garbage cleanup, things like that. And does IDL consider those when looking at the fiscal end line, whether or not it's an appropriate application?
That is an interesting angle to look at things, Brad. I'm going to ask either Bill or Jim to wade in there, or I can start it, I guess. Without knowing specifics, what I can tell you, what I know about case law, and I'm not an attorney, I won't pretend to be one. When the board is evaluating the uses of properties and how they generate revenue from it, typically, or based on what we've seen in prior case law, the board has to look at the bottom line financial number for the beneficiaries. So I think we'd see some challenges with that, but I'm going to kick it to Bill to kind of finish and take it from there.
Yeah, I think that's a good start to answering that question, Scott. And without a lot of specifics, Brad, it's difficult to dive too deep into that answer. You'd have to look at it, case by case, what it is, what the value to the beneficiaries is, and so on.
So would you dissuade anybody from submitting an application that has stewardship activities built into it?
I don't think today that I would want to dissuade anyone from creative ideas.
Okay. And maybe a better way to ask that question is it gross receipts or net receipts for management of a given piece of property that's the most important?
Yeah, and again, having to look at the details of the parcel and the activities and so on, and what our situation is there in terms of needs. We'd have to look at everything as we're considering that.
I do know that typically the ancillary benefits cannot be considered in the decision-making process. That's what we've seen, at least with other types of activities, but it does warrant, probably does warrant additional review. Christian, I think you have another question.
Thanks, and thanks again for including us in this process. One of the questions I have is really kind of going forward. If IDL, if this plan is accepted by the board, how soon would the classifications change on these lands? If a person, for instance, is putting together a lease application for something that's going to be changing, how do we go about understanding what the value of the land is in terms of what the lease values would be?
Jim or Bill?
Sorry. So we're kind of spelling out the timeline as we develop this plan, right? And as we put these parcels into tiers, and that's the general structure and the general timeline that you see there. Now, that being said, there could be a proposal that somebody submits, you know, a month from now or 6 months from now or something on some parcel that's farther out in the timeline that may accelerate that. We're going to have to adapt as things change across the landscape, but we've identified kind of the priority parcels for us, and that indicates some of the order of operations of how we would do things, subject to change as maybe other information comes to light or some proposal comes in that we don't know about or something like that.
Thanks. David had asked, what is IDL's view on the practical and legal constraints on reaping the maximum return from endowment lands? Let me try to interpret your question. If I miss this one, David, you could chime in and kind of narrow the focus a little bit. I think what you're really getting to is the discretionary authority of the board to make decisions. So at the end of the day, the board might have 2 or 3 options to weigh for a given parcel. And IDL will present analysis on what we think it would generate and maybe make a recommendation. But the board ultimately has all decision-making authority, and they're going to exercise what they believe is in the best interest of the beneficiaries when they make a decision. So in terms of practical versus legal constraints, the board will still have to operate within the confines of the constitutional mandate and those brown books with gold foil that we call Idaho statutes, but they have broad discretionary authority to make the final call.
Yeah, I was
close?
specifically thinking about the statutory environment, because certainly with regard to Payette Lake, there's plenty to look at there. So it's not like these lands are in the middle of nowhere. So that's kind of the context, and I just wanted to get the department's view on how those constraints are viewed, and whether the constitutional mandate absolutely trumps everything else in law.
The beneficiaries are going to come first, with acknowledgement that the board doesn't want to do things to degrade the values of its land assets. So I think what you're getting at is, how does the constitutional mandate play with like public trust doctrine embedded in code?
Well, the public trust doctrine carves out endowment lands as a separate animal, if you will, and we can get to some more of that later in my specific comments. But that's it's more coming at it from the other direction. You know, how do other public trust mandates influence decisions about endowment lands?
We want to ultimately be good neighbors, but at the end of the day, the beneficiaries have to come out on top, I think is probably a good way to put it. One of my teammates want to chime in and see if I've missed it or add to it.
I guess kind of what I'm hearing asked too is like, are we going to ignore certain laws in to meet the Constitution? And I guess the short answer to that from my perspective is no. There are lots of environmental laws and other laws that affect what we do on the ground. We follow those because that's what we do, and it's as those stack, that's what we have to rate our management decisions against. So yeah, if they were onerous enough that someone felt they were unconstitutional, then the board would go that route. We wouldn't just flat out ignore something. We would seek illegal relief if that were the case from a law. But there's, you know, We follow the Forest Practices Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. There's lots of state statutes that if you wanted to get into just as pure and simple economic analysis, yeah, they cost us money, but we meet and exceed those. So I guess that's kind of what I heard from your question. And so, yes, back to what Scott said, in light of those that are legal standing and that we have to follow, we were going to follow those. And then behind that is maximizing the economics in order to meet those.
Thanks, Jim. Bob had asked, IDL is unconstrained as to how they may or may not solicit public input, true or false? And Jonathan helped us out with an answer. Bob, IDL can answer that, but there is no statutory requirement to solicit input.
But what I was asking Scott was, you're really unconstrained, right?
Yeah, and what that really gets to is, I guess, two things. Number one, with the constitutional authority of the board, they are the decision maker.
Sure.
There's nothing that requires them or even suggests they should outsource their decision-making authority or yield that to other groups.
Right.
Additionally, given their mandate as fiduciaries in a trust environment, they have to act with undivided loyalty for the beneficiaries, and that would probably fall under the prudent investor standards.
But they're actually unconstrained as to their ability to take public process.
Yeah.
And thus
Well,
the process that you went through right here with the stakeholder group, the focus group, was such a process that, you know, they thought might be worthwhile. So if in development of the plan and the plan moving forward, there was value in terms of increasing the value of the property, maximizing return of the value by optimizing the process in which you came to those decision making, that would be a valid component of your plan going forward.
I don't think I fully understood what you just said, Bob.
Okay.
What I heard was that if there was a good business reason to bring in more public input, it's something the board would consider.
Yeah. So let me just restate it. So if as you develop your plan and you're looking at all the components of the plan, part of developing that plan was by in fact process, and the way you process and move forward with the plan, which has a public input component, they're actually increasing the overall value, maximizing the value of your land. That would be a valid component of the plan that you would recommend to IDL moving forward. The board. Just like a comment, just like you look at your return on your value. If in fact we came up with a process by which was improve the overvalue of the land, that would be something that you might want to consider in your recommendation to the board, because they're unconstrained in what that process can be. And I know you guys focus on the constraints. You don't have to do this. You don't have to do this. You don't have to do this. I get that. But I'm focusing on what you may be able to do that's in your best interest to increase the value of the land. Is that fair?
Not wanting to speak for the board, what I can tell you is that if they see an opportunity to improve a process in a way that lets them earn more money from the land, I think they'd be very interested in looking at it.
Super. And the only reason I'm bringing that up is because some of the comments, as you know, over time go to process a lot because it's hard to get out from that process. And some of the comments go to the plan. And so I'll hold my powder to later, but I think, overall, that there's a huge opportunity for IDL to increase the value of the endowment lands surrounding by Payette by refining the process that they've done in the past moving forward.
I do want to put a caveat on this idea of unconstrained, though. There are public interaction points built into many of the actions of the board and the department through different hearings. So particularly from the regulatory side of things. Let's see, what's the next? Go ahead, Julie.
Hi, I have two questions. The first one is in sort of a follow-up on the how would someone go about getting a lease subject. Is the PELS and sort of the specific information such as the revenue gaps that are set forth in the PELS, should those guide the public in determining a reasonable lease price?
Ryan.
Hey, Julie.
Hi.
So what we tried to accomplish with the gap was more of a situation where we could show that there is a gap. The disclaimer that we've made within the plan is that we don't have appraisals on most of these lands. So really to get an accurate picture of what that gap is and how much you need to make up would need to be through a more formal process. So some of these estimated values were based on previous estimates that we've done. So they're not accurate, really. It's just a guide that we've used. So if there was an application on a certain property, then we would need to go through the valuation process for that specific piece.
And would that valuation process also look at what the land use designation is? Would that be sort of subject to reevaluation or evaluation at that point?
Yeah, so it would be depending on different factors. So for example, if you were looking at a residential site, it would be based on a residential rate that's already been approved by the land board. For example, but if it was a recreation in the middle of, you know, the area outside of the impact, then that would be a completely different use and valuation.
Okay, in looking at the PELS right now, for example, if I see something that's designated as ag forest conservation, should I expect that any appraisal would be done on the basis that that is the designation of the land, or might that change to, for example, residential in the appraisal process?
So part of that depends on where you're identifying the designation. If you're identifying that as the designation by the current zoning, then that's different than perhaps what the use would be. So we don't instruct the appraiser to value the land in a specific way. However, we might adjust the return and the value. So for example, if you wanted to use a commercial enterprise on an area that's being used as timberland right now, we would potentially adjust the return rate based on that use to adjust for the value of the ground. Does that make sense?
I think so, yes. Okay, thank you very much. One other question, and this is a more general one. I'm just wondering, the PELS sort of outlines a lot about revenues and revenue gaps, and I'm curious about how IDL thinks about revenues versus long-term returns and what might be the relationship between these two.
Revenues versus long-term returns. Bill.
Yeah, Julie, good question. I mean, they're related, right? They're intertwined in many ways. The revenues that we get off a parcel in terms of long-term returns for the beneficiaries. There's other pieces to that too. We've talked about appreciation quite a bit and the long-term returns that could present for the beneficiaries, depending on the ultimate outcome of that parcel. The other way to look at long-term returns for the beneficiaries is, okay, let's say there was a parcel worth $10 million that maybe we're not able to get sufficient revenue off of now. What would that $10 million do in an alternate investment for the beneficiaries? So, you know, that's more of a disposal type of thought process there, right? Where you take the 10 million from the property and put it into, give it to the endowment fund investment board to manage, and you can expect a certain return on investment there. So there's a number of ways to look at long-term returns for the beneficiaries, depending on whether you're holding and leasing an asset, potentially disposing of an asset, and so on. It just depends.
Is there any concern that disposing of, in your example, a $10 million parcel that isn't throwing off revenue right now might undermine the possibility of obtaining $30 million in long-term returns if IDL were to wait 20 years and find some great use for it, or just appreciation?
Yeah, and you know, given the scale of numbers, for example, that you threw out there, yes, that, you know, we would want, if we can reasonably foresee something like that, right? And not just that the property was going to appreciate to that level, but that at some point the board would be able to capture that value for the beneficiaries in some way. Simply having an asset that's appreciating, but that we can't capture in any way, isn't as helpful for the beneficiaries.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Julie. So Bob let us know that it's from good powder to go skiing. Unfortunately, we're in a meeting for a little bit longer before we can hit the slopes. Craig had a question for Ryan. For appraisals, does IDL use uniform standards for professional appraisal practice, USPAP?
Yes.
All right.
I had a question too that bridges back. I think it was Kristen's question, or maybe it was someone else, about the notion of if a statute, was, how that would work if there was a statute that interfered or was deemed unconstitutional. And specifically, I'm thinking about one that we've talked about before, and that's 58-133. I can bring that up here really quick. It says, all state-owned lands classified as chiefly valuable for forestry, reforestation, recreation, and watershed protection are hereby reserved from sale and set aside as state forests. And I understand that to some degree that timberland classification kind of, address this to some degree. And I guess I just, I've heard some contention that law is just blatantly unconstitutional, and no, we're not going to follow it. But I've also heard IDL testify before the legislature saying we can't sell off our lands that are, timberland assets, because that's, violative of existing statute. And so I've kind of got two parts to my question. Can that law stand, is the first question.
So Jonathan, you're not going to like my answer on this.
Okay. Well, I guess
we're not going to roam into areas of interpreting statutes or legal advice today.
But I guess so that's fine. But I guess and I understand from some of the prior conversation that there was a recreation classification. I'm not sure there's ever been a watershed protection classification, but I think for so many reasons, this is really kind of eliciting, I think, some of the statutory direction contained in that law that says these lands that are chiefly valuable for those purposes should be retained. And that's not to say that, you couldn't in some way, shape, or form, potentially reclassify those. But I guess this kind of gets at that key issue of how are those lands, how do we identify lands important for watershed protection? Are there any classified as such in the state? And are those actually reserved? So anyways, I just think these are valuable issues to explore, but understand we could, spend a whole semester of a law class exploring some of these issues. But I do think they're directly relevant to the discussion.
I'm going to answer part of that with my kind of plain spoken approach to how we do things. Asset classifications are really something internal to IDL that we use to classify different ways to make money on land, whether it's recreation, whether it's timber, or et cetera, commercial. Bill, is that pretty much a plain spoken way to put it?
Yes, Scott, that is, and it's about what the land is, not necessarily what's happening on the land. And so there are probably acres included as timberland that may not be primary timber acres. They may not be even particularly productive timber acres, but they fall into that larger asset class of timberland, and those are fairly broad. And we have 2.5 million acres, and it's not, you're never going to have a completely clean classification of those acres as you try to do that statewide. There are parcels where you could argue that something else could be that asset class, but then you could also follow a path where you suddenly have 10 or 12 asset classes. Whereas we established this structure back in 2016. It also guides our financial reporting that we do, which happens by asset class. And that's put us into a situation where we have consistent means of financial reporting. We can measure our progress over time. And it's really worked quite well for us as land managers to have these asset classes.
Thanks, Bill. See, I don't see any more questions in the chat appliance. Does anyone have their hand up?
I was trying to type. I think I misspelled discretion. No, I got it. Spell check cut it for me. Sorry. So let me just state the question. So we know we have, the proposal from Trident, and we don't talk about that much on here, but I'll just, in front of you now. And we know we've been talking about conservation easements and the opportunity for a conservation easement. So how does the board and land designated as timberland, it's not in transition right now, and they receive a proposal for a conservation easement over that property, which doesn't restrict the use of the timberland as it's currently being used, meaning harvested for timber. So you're getting your returns. Thus, it's not in transition right now because it's returning the investment that you expect. How do you determine that that's the best long-term value for that land? In other words, you get a proposal, a conservation easement, 5,000 acres on a piece of property. It adds X dollars over the years to that value of the land is currently managed as timberline. It's not transition property. You're meeting your. How does staff make that recommendation to the board that that's the long-term best use of that land?
Ryan?
I'm not sure how to answer that question. Conservation easements are unique, and the department owns conservation easements, but since I've been there, we haven't actually had a conservation easement that's encumbered the ground, and nor do I know that there's one that's been approved by the land board in quite a while, if there's ever been one. So there would have to be quite a bit of evaluation and additional information to answer that question. So for example, what would be the restrictions? Where is it located? What's the term? So is it perpetual versus the term? So it's a very difficult question to answer. However, if that question was posed, and I know that there's been some discussions of conservation easements, we'd have to do a fairly substantial evaluation to really understand what that means, whether it's in the best interest. Is it unduly burdensome, which means that we can't do anything? There's also some legal questions that are going to have to be answered, because what does that look like in terms of a disposition? And if it's a disposition, then do we have to conflict it? So it opens up quite a few questions.
Ryan, can I ask you to expand on one further point? So one of the things I kind of heard between the lines of your response is that there's going to be some expertise needed sometimes to help evaluate proposals. Could you tell us a little bit about IDL's approach to making sure we have the right people at the table to help do the evaluations?
Sure, thanks, Scott. So the land board has approved the department to use experts and advisors, and that was approved quite a few years ago. And we have a pre-qualified list, and those lists are broken down into subject matter. So we do have an approved list of timber advisors, for example. So those advisors can be used for acquisitions. They can be for dispositions and also exchanges. And the board has typically said that they would like to have at least 2 sets of eyes on some sort of transaction. So whether that's IDL and an advisor or an advisor and IDL, that's what they would like to see prior to the decision coming back to the board.
All right. Nick, you're next. And then I see Chad, you have a question. You'll be on deck after Nick asks his question.
Okay, just to follow up on a couple questions, and more specifically, as Bob highlighted, I recognize that, evaluating a conservation easement is more difficult, but let's look at it in terms of how you would evaluate a proposal for disposition or swap. And, because it's more specifically, if you have an area that has a high commercial value, but it's classified as timber, walk us through, and it's on the lake, let's say, between Paradise Point and, wherever to the north or to the south. Walk us through the process for how you determine what the best use assessment is, given that it's classified as timber. I'm very curious about that.
Ryan?
Sure, thanks, Nick. So we keep talking about asset classes as some sort of delegation to what the department can and can't do. We own 2.5 million acres, and Nick, you deal with investments. So there's different categories that you have to put the different investments in, but it doesn't mean that it's mutually, or it has to be. That's a bad example. So we have to classify the 2.5 million acres of land somehow. And for us, our leadership has said, this is how we're going to designate it so that we can identify it, or else you're talking about having probably 1,000 different types of categories of land that we have to manage. So in order to make it manageable, they've decided that timber, range, minerals, and the other asset classes are how they're going to categorize land. That's internal to us so that we can do reporting, so that we can use different billings and management techniques for that specific purpose. But every acre of ground that we own can be transitioned into a different asset classification for some reason. And ultimately, it's the land board who's going to decide whether they want to keep it as a designation or not. But that doesn't mean that we can't use it for something else. And so, Nick, and everybody else for that matter, when we're talking about asset classifications, it's just how we identify the ground. So even though it's identified as timber, we have residential cottage sites that were originally timber that are now residential that we can sell. So ultimately, it's where we're going to maximize the revenue, and then how do you classify that in order to track it. And so the tracking mechanism, I think, is what's causing some of this confusion, because it really is just a way that we track the lands. So Nick, if you're talking about a land exchange or a disposition, ultimately what we're looking at is identifying the piece of ground, doing some sort of due diligence to figure out what it has on it, what it could potentially be used for, and then providing some level of information to a third-party appraiser who's going to do their own market analysis on it. So if we have, for example, Dinehart, and if it's not being used for anything right now, and it has trees on it, we're not telling the appraiser that it has to be valued as timberland. It's just, that's what we have it valued as, because that's what we're classifying it as it for that purpose of our tracking. But what they're probably going to look at is, well, it's in the middle of an area that's zoned commercial. It's in the middle of an area that has residential zoning. It has full utilities. It has full access. This is what we would classify it as under USPAP standards. And this is what we would do the evaluation on and classify it as, and this is what the market value is. And then so if we had an exchange, for example, then the proponent would have to go and find another piece of property that has that same value. Land exchanges are for value, so that's how we would look at that. Did that answer your question?
It does, yeah. I mean, I guess part of what you tasked us with, Scott, at the beginning is, how do we establish a process for evaluating things going forward, things being disposition or, swaps of assets, right? And I think, a component of that is, look, I don't want to tie up tax dollars evaluating a proposal, right, that is a fraction of what the market value of a property is. That's a waste of time. It's a waste of money, right? And, I just wanted to get an understanding of how, when you assess kind of that best use value of a property, like, I just want to make sure that, one idea would be, if something is below, like a proposal is so far below the market value of something, why would you even waste the time to consider it? And that's kind of what I was driving towards.
Yeah, and Nick, that's a problem that we deal with on a daily basis. And we've had pieces of property on the market and we'll get offers for $1. I mean, we're not going to spend time to evaluate that, but it's people out there that'll just put anything out there. And so there's a certain degree of expertise that the department does have, and it can rely on to do an initial evaluation to see whether or not it's worth pursuing. And there's been proposals that have question marks on them on whether they should be pursued. There's also proposals that maybe we can tailor or adjust that do make sense. And so we have to look at them on an individualized basis to see whether it's a waste of time, or whether we even shift the cost on the proponent to show that there's some value there. Because we only have so much staff. The Real Estate Bureau has 14 folks, and 2 of those are really based on transactions. So there's no way that the department can handle multiple different scenarios just for the sake of doing it. So we try to at least have some consultation with the areas, see if it makes sense with the areas, And then if there's some merit, then we can talk with the proponent. And if there's not, then we try to quit it as quick as possible and move on to the next thing.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ryan and Nick. So we'd allocated 1 hour to this portion of the agenda, and we have one final question. This is from Chad Hauk. And Ryan, this is regarding conservation easements. Have you ever seen one submitted? You said you've never seen one accepted by the board.
Thanks, Chad. No, I have not seen one submitted.
All right.
Thank you, Scott. I just wanted to make sure, thank you, Ryan, for that answer. I just want to make sure everyone was clear. You raised some very great questions on the different things that would have to be figured out from a logistical standpoint and some of the conflicts that may be there. However, at this point, I'm not aware, and you just confirmed for me, I believe, that it isn't something that we've considered, at least in recent history. It isn't something that we've been presented with the opportunity to look into. So that certainly shouldn't stop anyone from considering that as an option.
Thank you, Chad. Agreed completely. And for my service over the years as a land board staffer for a couple controllers and a superintendent, I can't recall one coming in either. I've been around since, I don't know, 2000.
Well, let's qualify it. None for endowment land.
And
we definitely handle them in other aspects of the agency. And in those cases, they are generally conservation easements that protect from development and keep working forests. So
and
that's the expertise that we have.
And Jim is speaking about the Forest Legacy Program.
Yes.
All right, so kind of getting back to the agenda, item B, feedback plan discussion. The ground rules. I'll call on you individually based on where you fall on the list of attendees at the top of the agenda. You'll have 5 minutes. We're going to ask you to let us know what you think is missing in the plan, what should be changed in the plan, provide some insights to how to implement the plan. And if there's anything that you see as good in the plan, we'd love to hear about that as well. I'll put you in the hot seat, but if you don't have any comments, you're welcome to say pass, or you're welcome to use all or part of your 5 minutes. Then at 2:30, we'll call for a break. After a 15-minute break, we'll come back and we'll finish working through the list of attendees' comments. All right, so Anna Canning, you're up.
All right, I was glad the questions went on for a while, so I had a little time to gather my thoughts. So thank you for bringing us together, and it's been really interesting hearing everybody's views on recreation and watershed protection and conservation around the McCall area. And that and those really are the basis of my concern. I heard a lot about those three things and the importance of those, and especially it is in the McCall comprehensive plan for conservation in that area. And it really seems to be the vision. And my concern is achieving that vision. One way of doing that is through purchase of those properties by a nonprofit agency. Another is through clustered development with large tracts of dedicated open space. My concern is that the way that the PELS is structured with its incremental approach, it kind of negates either of those possibilities. I'm disappointed that there's not a large scale disposition or trade alternative considered, and the possible benefits of that versus the incremental approach. Incrementalism works well sometimes. I don't think it works well for conservation, watershed protection, or linear recreation resources. Those are pretty high level concerns, so I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. And Susan Buxton is also on the line. I'll leave my remaining time to her if I can. Scott.
Right. Thank
She's
you,
our new director.
Annette, you are next.
Okay, hi everyone. I'd like to echo our thanks for being involved in the process and being able to give you city feedback. And what I'm trying to do right now is get my the draft letter open that the city council will be considering tomorrow for submission to the state land board for the public comment deadline. So if you just give me like a split second here to, I almost had it open right before you called on me. And then also Michelle from the city is on the line, and I think she has some technical comments for you as well. But I'll give you the more of the big picture comments that our council has worked on, because we've been keeping them up to date through this focus group process. So the future of land development and conservation around Big Payette Lake is a primary concern for our community and will impact Idaho for generations. And I'm just going to paraphrase this, not read the whole thing. We're very happy you're using the McCall Area Comprehensive Plan to help inform your decisions. And in a previous meeting, when Director Miller talked about trying to find win-win opportunities, we were very feeling very hopeful that that really may happen. And so hopefully that doesn't get lost in all of the technical debate, you know, going on with the group, but really successfully finding something that satisfies multiple stakeholders. Anyway, in the letter, the council strongly urges the land board to consider the following. Number one, Big Payette Lake is the sole source of drinking water for our community. So it is critical to us that this natural resource is preserved and protected. We recommend that any analysis of the parcels within the watershed that feed the lake should be evaluated and include the cost of mitigation measures if they were to be developed to protect the shoreline and riparian areas, to prevent untreated runoff and erosion impacts, and to retain the maximum amount of undisturbed drainage areas with natural vegetation for low-cost treatment of runoff. And the strategy and any subsequent plan should honor the decades of work by Idaho DEQ and our local community to protect the water quality of the lake. So essentially, maybe there's a cost benefit analysis in there that the cost of doing mechanical, what is in essence stormwater treatment before anything runs off into the drainage areas and into the lake may be more expensive to the land than if you just left it in the naturally vegetated state and protected it as a water treatment facility for the lake in certain areas. The next is to prioritize the development of the state 80 within the city limits for entry to mid-level priced housing. We see this as a really good opportunity, a strategic opportunity to work with us and our partners to address our local housing crisis. And this could be a real win-win for our local economy, our employers, the families and service workers that support McCall while creating the economic value needed for the endowment fund. We recommend that you prioritize the use of conservation easements, which will protect the most sensitive parcels adjacent to the lake and allow for the recreational uses while maintaining state ownership. And that we do agree that we would like you to allow time for local conservation groups and other stakeholders to create these easements, which will provide you with fair market value compensation and meet the public's goals for access, recreation, and conservation. And lastly, we would encourage you to continue to provide for stakeholder engagement throughout all of your processes. We find that it's very valuable to us as well because problem solving and innovation comes from utilizing the talents of our community. And it will build goodwill and understanding for your efforts and help with the implementation of your plan. And then we specifically thank the board for considering these comments, and we want to call out specifically Ryan Montoya and Scott Corkle, who have been really made themselves available to the city and our staff on an ongoing basis. And we really appreciate their extra efforts to engage with us in our community. So we look forward to working with you and hopefully as part of this focus group or whatever comes afterwards.
Thank you, Annette.
Mhm.
Brad, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, mine'll be brief. But I want to preface them a little bit. I think as I originally mentioned in meeting one, I'm representing Idaho Sportsmen, a relatively new group that advocates for access and opportunity for hunters, anglers, and trappers to and through quality habitats in the state. You know, overall, start with what, you know, there are some things in the plan that don't give us pause. And first and foremost is the scale of it. You know, it kind of focuses on 373 acres. As sportsmen, we're much more concerned with the 24,000 acres or the 74,000 acres or the 100,000 acres or the 2.5 million acres. You know, realizing that some of these parcels are isolated and do not provide much sporting opportunity. We recognize they can provide some huge community and neighborhood property or value. I just had a phone call come in on, sorry about that. My phone was off, but my computer allows me to talk on it too. So it wasn't turned off. So the scale of it, it doesn't overly concern us. Properties G and E up against on that east side, you know, depending on what happens there, they could potentially impact access to other properties for hunting, fishing, trapping. Also, like the commitment to coordination with county and city that's built into the plan. I think it can also be strengthened. There's specific reference to coordination in tiers 3 and 4, but I believe it's missing in tiers 1 and 2. And I think from the standpoint, I believe counties and cities can take actions that limit management activities on IDL lands and put you in a position where you have to consider transition. But if that coordination can occur up front so that everybody can work together on not forcing one another's hands on what can occur on specific parcels. Also, I think it's a reasonable balance between prescription, which identifies specific properties and some timelines, and the what's and the whys and the hows, but is open-ended enough to allow the land board ultimate decision space. And I think that's a tough balance to reach. Ultimately, the land board's going to want endless decision space, and then communities and IDL need some kind of sense of where we're going and how fast and what it's going to look like when we get there. So I think it does present a reasonable balance. Things that I'd like to see maybe touched on or strengthened in the plan, again, that coordination between city and county. There's been a lot of talk about transition, adding some definition or process or into it. What is it? Because it seems a little vague and it seems to be pretty critically important. So to what happens to a given piece of parcel or parcel of land. So you know, overall, we are not overly concerned because of the scale of it. You know, considering there's other interests out there that are working or proposing on a scale much bigger than this, those cause us some pause. This one doesn't have the same level of impacts as others out there. And lastly, there's been quite a bit of discussion about creating another asset category, recreation or conservation or easement or something. You know, I don't have an answer, but I can relate to it. You know, the 5 categories: timber, range, mining, commercial, residential, have served the state very, very well for 131 years. Will those 5 categories continue to serve the state and the beneficiaries for the next 131 years? I don't know. But I do know that if you asked me 10 years ago, if I could have bought goods and services with cryptocurrency, money I can't even see or touch, I would have told you you're crazy. So I think it does, hopefully somebody's given some thought to, what are potential future categories, because the future will look a lot like the past, but it'll also be different.
Thanks, Brad. Appreciate it. Brian Harris, floor is yours, sir. Brian, I see you logged in. Your video's turned off. Are you with us still? All right. If Brian comes back on, we'll give him an opportunity. Next, then, Brian Scott, please.
Well, I agree a lot with what Brad just said. What I'm taking away from this is I think that there's an educational piece that's missing. I mean, I think that a lot of us here in the focus group still have a lot of questions as to some of IDL's processes and the constitutional mandates that they go through. I'm very appreciative for this opportunity and for IDL and everybody to convene this focus group to solicit our comments. I think a big part that's missing, like I said, is an education piece or public notice piece. I think that a lot of people, a lot of stakeholders are unfamiliar with the process and how to go about it, and are unfamiliar about certain lands that maybe are in question as in transition, or that IDL is looking at proposals for. And maybe had they had better notice or knew about that, it could energize a lot of stakeholders in the Payette Lakes region that want to see the lands go to a different use and want to get creative with trying to satisfy IDL's mandate for funds to go to the beneficiaries, and that there could be a lot of interesting and exciting uses and opportunities for this land if more people were in the know about what is maybe coming down the pipe and what lands there could be some potential opportunities for. That's really all I have.
All right. Thanks, Brian. Chris Anton.
Scott, I'm going to pass and let others use my time. Thank you.
Clive.
There we go. Scott, thanks for the opportunity to speak today. As I've been listening to the conversations over the last few weeks, it's very reminiscent of what I spent 30 plus years of my career doing and covering the same territory. The dilemma we have is we are managing lands that are deemed by the public to be public lands and equivalent to Forest Service lands or BLM lands, when in fact the lands were dedicated to the state as part of the Constitution for specific beneficiaries. And it's that beneficiary duty and trying to carry it out in the context of a governmental situation that makes this issue so difficult, because there's a lot of competition for the use of these particular lands, particularly where they're intermingled with other lands. And so I think a good part of this discussion that we spent on classification is really missing the mark. Aside from probably the high productive forest lands, almost every land within the Department of Lands could be deemed transition lands, that there's other opportunities for their use. And so the question then, in my mind, boils down to, when you get this high competition, which is what we have up around Payette Lake, how is the land board going to manage those lands? And I know there's a desire to maintain them for recreation and watershed protection, which I think are all valuable purposes. But whether that is the appropriate purpose for which these land are devoted is a separate question, because there needs to be a way to monetize those benefits to the benefit of the beneficiaries. And so what I see in the plan itself, I think the scale is right. You're looking at it from the perspective of where the most pressure is at the present time. And I think you're also looking at it correctly from the standpoint of a time frame. But I think what's missing from the plan is the component that deals with the financial aspect of this. There's been a lot of discussion about appreciation, and certainly appreciation is an important part of these lands and should be taken into consideration, but you've also got to take into account whether there's ultimately going to be an opportunity for realization of that appreciation. And that was really the driver back when we were dealing with the cottage site issues, is that certainly there was a lot of value in those cottage sites and an opportunity, if you were in a true private sector setting, to be able to realize the benefit of that. But the reality was there was a lot of political aspect or pressure that comes into the management of those lands that was just not allowing us to realize the true benefit. And so that's what led to the disposition plan, a realization that if you can't manage the lands in accordance with your trust responsibility, you need to move forward, dispose of them, and get into an asset that you can manage. And I think that's really the issue that we're trying to deal with here, is that very issue. These lands have now changed in nature to where they have a higher value, and the question is how to realize that value. But I don't think you set aside the appreciation issue. You've got to keep that in mind. And I think that's missing from this plan. There's not a discussion about, okay, if we've got them in these categories and we're looking at what the opportunities are, what's the timing that we should be looking at those dispositions? And what's the size and magnitude of those dispositions that would occur? Or when I use dispositions, I'm talking both about leases, sales, and other types of use of land. What's the timing that we would want to go forward and make those decisions? That's all going to require more detail than what you have on the page. But in terms of the framework you're operating in, it seems to me it's the appropriate framework. It just needs more meat on the bones, so to speak, from my perspective, if I were looking at it and wanting to make decisions. And I think that there are some lands that you clearly are going to have to look at and get a disposal plan in place on fairly quickly. Like, for instance, the remaining cottage sites. If you think about, I think we probably have 20 or 30 remaining cottage sites around the lake. State ownership of those cottage sites really doesn't make sense, because at this point in time, the cost of managing those lands exceeds the values that we're receiving in return from those. But on the other hand, some of these larger parcels that are undeveloped may have a much greater potential use. And so to me, it's a matter of looking at opportunity and maybe moving away from land's traditional position of waiting for a proposal to come in, because I think there was some discussion, I can't remember who raised it, but you don't want to be wasting your time on proposals that really don't achieve full value. There ought to be a way to dispose of those up front and be more proactive in terms of how you're going to go forward. And then on the other side, I think to the extent that there's recreation and conservation, those are certainly legitimate uses, but traditionally those have been thought of as kind of an ancillary use of the lands. And so it's been more of a free rider situation. And so you need to, if those are going to come forward, there needs to be a process for putting those on the table and evaluating them versus other alternatives. For example, it seems to me that the idea of conservation leases or recreational leases makes a lot of sense if these lands are going to be in transition for a period of time. And it's a way to realize the value while at the same time recognizing the appreciation. So I know I've put a lot in there, but I'll stop with that.
Thank you very much, Clive. All right, Craig, the floor is yours, please.
Thanks, Scott. And again, I'm going to echo everybody in saying how much I and the Payette Land Trust appreciate the opportunity to be involved in this discussion in the focus group. I think one of the things that has been a real positive to come out of this experience is the increase in the relationship that the Payette Land Trust has with the department. My relationship and my board members' relationships with Director Miller, Ryan Montoya, Sid Anderson, Jason King, Scott Corcoral, Angela Kaufman, and Daryl Early didn't really exist on much of a level prior to this. And the opportunity for us to learn about IDL and the inner workings of that is very important, because what we've learned out of this and what I think the plan has helped get right is the fact that the Payette Land Trust now realizes that we actually may have a place to play in helping the land board reach their fiduciary duty in providing the most financial benefit back to the beneficiaries. And what I mean by that is, as we've heard a lot of talk about conservation easements, which it just brings joy to my heart that so many people are mentioning this now, that we have more questions than answers. And not just the Payette Land Trust, but I think IDL has questions for the land trust that then we in return provide another question back before we get the answer. So I really believe that's been one of the biggest positives to come out of this, is finding out that there are opportunities out there that we need to spend more time on developing, that protocols and procedures need to be put into place. Another thing that I think we've all learned is that that recreation, the industry, does have a part to play, and probably in some areas on par with the other traditional uses. And so how do we bring that industry into the fold with IDL and generate a relationship that the timber industry has with IDL? And I know that's going to take some time, and it would take probably staff positions and maybe a little bit more of a directional change for these lands that do garner a lot of potential income to the land board from recreation. So I hope that we were able to enter some kind of language into the plan that starts to do sort of what Clive was saying, and that is increase the availability to monetize value. Because timber is just value until it's monetized, but then so is conservation and so is recreation. So timber has a great way of monetizing that value because it's a time-honored, and tested system. So I believe that there is an avenue for that. I would also just sort of reiterate the calls for conservation easement protocol. I think it's pretty obvious that the land trust would like to see this happen, and we're planning to bring forth a proposal so that we can ask the questions and have it on the table as a viable option. And with this conservation easements in perpetuity, buying those at fair market value brings a portion of that appreciated value actually to cash that can be invested elsewhere, which may actually help to diversify your portfolio. And the plan having an avenue for that, I think, is hugely important. At the same time, we can hold on to those traditional uses that have always been there. And I think that's sort of the idea, is to find that balance and the win-win that the plan is asking for. And I think that's part of the plan that is right, that ask for a win-win. How do we meet this financial obligation of the land board while opening up opportunities to other entities and industries to participate in a program that not only funds our education system here in the state of Idaho, because we'd have to pay more taxes if we didn't, but also generate the need for access to the outdoors, the need for timber, the need for grazing, and all those things that we talk about. So I'm really encouraged that we're having these conversations. I will say that I feel the timeline has been somewhat compressed for all of these questions. And I do hope that we have a strong case to legitimately do due diligence on some of these things that have been asked about the plan, the gaps and the holes that we have an opportunity to fill will take time. And I honestly don't see the rush. We're talking about properties that were given to us in statehood. I don't know if we need to make ultimate decisions, within months, but I understand that there's an obligation to reach those fiduciary duties. But I do think we have the time to continue this conversation. I'll leave it at that. So thanks again, Scott. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Craig. I received a note from Susan Buxton that she has another commitment she must attend to, and she's willing to be brief. So Susan, would you please take the floor? And after Susan finishes, we'll go on to break.
Thank you, Scott. Everybody, thank you for your patience. And Dustin, thank you for inviting me, and Department of Parks and Recreation. I want to reiterate that Anna has done a nice job summarizing what Parks and Recreation is certainly available to do. But I also want to add to what Clive Strong said, and also Mr. Utter. I do also agree that with regard to recreation uses and conservation uses, that figuring out a way to monetize that and to the benefit of the endowment is something we can all work together for. And I, as the new director of Parks and Rec, would like to work closely with the department to help do that, because we do have some ability to try and bring some of our skill set to you that we wouldn't have to double up with personnel. So with that end, I am happy to be a source of help for this and for the land board. So thank you all for all of your time and all of everybody's efforts in all these meetings. So that's all I've got, Scott. Thank you.
Director, thank you very much. Benny Sursa once said, "Blessed are the brief, for they shall be invited back. We shall invite you back." That said, it is 2:30 p.m. Let's take a break for 15 minutes and we'll resume promptly at 2:45. We'll see you all in just a few. Hello again, everyone. It's 2:44, so this is your 1-minute warning. We'll resume our meeting in about 60 seconds. All right, so it is 2:45 p.m., the appointed time to reconvene. Next on deck, Dave, are you there?
Yep, sure am. Thank you.
Very good. All right, sir.
I was going to say, I think the further we go into these comments, the less we're going to have to talk about. It seems like we're echoing a lot of what people before us are saying. So I don't have a lot to say. I just would echo what everybody else has already said, is that the good side of all of this process has been the IDL's efforts to get the focus group together. We really do appreciate it. I do think that it would benefit us to continue the process and give, the jurisdictions and the stakeholders involved a little bit more time to continue the process. I think we're getting close to seeing some pretty positive recommendations coming out of this process, but I do think that we all have some ideas that are going to take some additional time to develop. So with that, I'll go on into kind of some of the things that I see as lacking. And I think that the PELS plan not placing a little bit more importance on recreation and its impact to the local communities. It's been stated a lot, but I don't think that was really examined within the PELS document. And it's something that's very important as a moneymaker for these areas, and certainly could be for IDL as well. The other part that has come up that I didn't see any mention of, and I think it would be really good to start thinking about, is the idea of maybe like access easements with these disposition lands as things start to go, whichever way they go. We want to be able to continue to access the national forest lands beyond. We want to be able to access the shorelines of the lake. And so, thinking about putting into maybe IDL, if they do sell a piece of property, putting in, a piece of ground as an access easement would be a really great addition to the plan. As far as my recommendations, I already said, I think we need a little more time. So I'd really hope that you guys would consider allowing more time for everyone to expand their comments into, a complementary plan or a proposal that could help augment, some of the recommendations in the PELS. Then the last part is I just really encourage IDL and the land board to look at how some of these alternative solutions like conservation easements and recreation leasing could complement, current IDL management strategies. I think that there's a lot of room to work within the context of having a conservation easement with a recreational lease, and certainly, the opportunity to continue to harvest trees down the road, removal for rocks other things, grazing. So I think that there's really a lot of room for us to look at how those things can go together and how that can offset the gaps that we're talking about in the revenue. So again, I'm being brief. I don't have a lot to add, and we thank you all for your time.
Well, thanks, Dave. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Scott. First, I'd say in terms of what's right about this process is that the department in general is listening to folks. And on behalf of my board, I want to thank all of you for creating this process and inviting us into the tent. And along with that, building relationships is certainly something that this is doing, and that's going to be extremely valuable to everybody going forward. I don't know if it's specifically part of the plan, but the establishment of the pause or the moratorium in decision making to allow this plan to unfold is a very positive aspect of the overall process here. I think it's going to allow for better decision making than you might have had otherwise. On what's missing, I would say maybe comprehensiveness. The plan to me seems like part of a plan. It's kind of an appendix or a chapter of a plan that really covers such a broad swath that it would take plenty more time and plenty more pages to really lay it all out. So you know, I hope that as you go forward, you'll take the time to expand on the plan, make it more comprehensive. And last, I think, you know, what I alluded to earlier is how the plan's conclusions or recommendations are maybe colored by or constrained by Idaho law. And I just want to talk a little bit about that, because Payette Lake and the Endowment Lands and the watershed that the lands are in are joined at the hip. So the implementation of a plan for these lands will influence the water quality, sustainability, and character of Payette Lake. But the lake and the lands are two separate things with their own legal mandates and constraints. So why should the lake be of direct concern to IDL and the land board in the context of this strategy for land management? And the short answer, I think, is constraints, compromise, and success. And I'll break those down a little bit. The plan, the department, and the land board should recognize that a fiduciary trust mandate for the school endowment is not entirely unconstrained, but that Idaho's laws do provide a lot of guidance about how we move forward. You know, I keep going back to Idaho Code 6743 in terms of how it maybe influences the trust mandate in Article 9. And the department and the land board just are going to need to decide how to balance those things. They are in direct tension with each other. The law that sets out that the endowment lands are not subject to the public trust doctrine also says that the public trust doctrine does specifically apply to Payette Lake. So it's kind of a roundabout way of imposing a public trust doctrine on the endowment lands, if you will. So the endowment lands mandate and the Payette Lake mandate have to somehow coexist. They're both responsibilities of the state. The decisions that the land board and the department make about endowment lands can either uphold or fail to uphold the Payette Lake public trust mandate. And of course, there's other constraints such as protecting public drinking water, as has been already mentioned, responding to additional water quality beneficial use attainment.
We're at 5 minutes, David.
So those are the broad brush items. I think as you continue, there's going to be moments when everyone will find it necessary to stop and consider the context, the effects, and the consequences that feed back into this kind of governance. So I hope that the department and the land board will feel free to take plenty of time to think this through. There is a whole lot at stake here.
All right.
We're extremely glad that you asked us to be part of this forum. And we understand that you want us to help the state's planning process be an exemplary success. So we're here to help.
Thank you, David. We're well past 5 minutes now. Appreciate your remarks, sir. Diane, you're next.
Thank you, Scott. And thank you to the department for putting this focus group together. I also hope that not only will our comments be helpful here at Payette Lake, but hopefully this is a template that you might be able to use in other parts of the state. It's also not lost on me that we have the senior administration of the Department of Lands here every day. And that's a very big commitment. And it's an especially big commitment during the legislative session. I know that from experience. So thank you. I think the good thing about the plan is that it's very intentional. You're putting parcels into tiers and you're telling the public what your intentions are about those particular parcels. That gives the community, both near to Payette Lake as well as statewide, an ability to sort of stage themselves on what to focus on in terms of what lands might be in play. And in terms of resources for everyone, I think that's a really beneficial thing. My first point is that I think that PELS should be a really defining document for the department and the land board. We talked about this last week, or last meeting, excuse me, and the discussion was in terms of how changeable or unchangeable the PELS document might be. And my recollection is that their answer was, we look at every application individually. But I think if the department and the land board are going to spend this amount of time on this document, that it really needs to be a statement of intent. In last week's Star News, Charla Arledge, who's the spokesman for the Department of Lands, said, this plan will be the lens through which IDL will review all opportunities and applications. And I think that's right. Secondly, though, 75% of the plan is the parcels, and we haven't had the opportunity to talk about the parcels, but I think there has to be a full vetting of these parcels and how they are organized within the tiers, how they are identified as asset classes in order for the PELS document to be complete. And I don't know how you go about getting public input on the parcels, but I think it's very important that that be done before this document is finalized. My second point is that I don't think any of the lands around Payette Lake or adjacent to it should be sold without a tremendous amount of vetting. We have got to somehow be able to recognize the increased value of this land. These lands are like growth stocks that you decide you're going to sell because they don't pay enough dividend. And that is a short-sighted way to look at these lands. In working with the Valley County assessor, she tells me that Payette Lakefront has increased 15.4% in linear feet in 2 years and 25.6% in 3 years. Even far back tier West Side properties have gone up 10.4% in 2 years. Those are huge numbers to walk away from, especially when you're looking at a 4% rental rate of return as being what you prefer. I will quote a great landowner in Idaho who said, any land that's worth this much to somebody else is worth a lot more to me because I already own it. And we already own this land. We don't have to pay for it. So I think that it's really important for us to look back on the 1999 recommendations by the Governor's Committee on Endowment Reform. One needs to look at the combined impact of all the investments and not the investments on an individual basis. We may have lands that can easily surpass 4% rental rate of return a year. We may have some lands, and I know the department has acknowledged this, that are going to be best held for future appreciation. And I really think that has to be critically looked at. My third point is to echo recreation conservation asset classes. And I certainly understand what Ryan is saying, that you use your current asset classes as a tracking mechanism. But when the public looks at that, I think what the public is seeing is an intentional statement of how you wish to use those lands. And it sounds like that may not be the case, but I think by expanding some of the asset classes you're willing to look at on certain lands, you're going to give a positive nod to people and encourage them to come forward with proposals and applications that may be more broad-based than what you've had in the past. And lastly, because we have not been able to look at the parcels, I do think it is very important for the department to explain to the land board that this focus group is not weighing in on the individual parcels during this effort of 3 meetings. I don't want by omission for the land board to think that we have signed off on all of the lands that have been identified to go into play and what their tier allocations are. So I think it's important. Thank you. I'm done.
Okay. Thank you very much. And for everyone, I apologize that I have to interrupt you near the end. I don't mean in a malicious way. I'm just trying to keep everything on track. Next on deck, Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And yes, thanks again. This is really very interesting and obviously helpful for me as part of the Forest Service. And so I've got a little bit of a different lens in terms of as I read through this, and we read through our environmental documents and things like that, I found this very clean and very clear, which is not always the case with some of our documents. And so I really appreciated that aspect of it. One of the things though that there are a few things that when I read through this, there were certain areas that I didn't feel like the full picture was being painted. And so in terms of things that were missing, there was almost like this existing condition where some of the existing condition, like utilities and things like that, were included, but recreation opportunities, current trails or roads or access were not included in the descriptions throughout this. And obviously recreation is important, but it was it wasn't even addressed that there's a snowmobile trail that might go through some of those parcels or something like that, and that just paints that picture in terms of future opportunities and what's really on the ground. And so that's one of the things that I think from the Forest Service aspect and from obviously from us, that access between the lands, the community to the national forest. So being able to provide some of those, adding some of those recreation opportunities, whether it be it trails or roads, I think is really important. Another part that, and we'll provide a map, but is just that access. Obviously there are a lot of roads that go through IDL to the National Forest. So we'll provide a pretty cursory map with some of the areas that we do have easements and things like that. I mean, for example, one of our trailheads, Fall Creek, the trail doesn't have an easement across IDL. So it's definitely some things that would be important to kind of include, well, would be important to include because it shows some of the effects of that. Another aspect that we talked about was just that wasn't addressed in this was the wildland urban interface and potentially bringing more people into areas that we already have limited access. And talking with some of our fire folks, they have said that during some multi-jurisdictional meetings, that access to some of these further out properties is difficult anyway, one way in, one way out. And if you're dealing with public or private residents and just that ingress and egress. So just I'll quickly wrap up. So the couple of things that we see that could be beefed up in this plan is just adding the existing condition of recreation, what's currently there, what's being used, what trails are there, what roads are there, what recreation opportunities are currently existing. Access, where do we have access to between the community and public lands? And then just the wildland urban interface and some of those issues in terms of where we go from, or where the potential of where we go from here forward. That's it for me.
Thank you, Jennifer. Jonathan, your camera's off. I don't know if you're still with us, but if you are, the floor is yours. There you are.
Of course, I am with you for every moment. I just had some visitors come through. So, anyways, yeah, first, I know that at times some of my question can, be a little probing and seem adversarial, but ultimately I am very, very, very appreciative. And on behalf of all the 35,000 members and supporters of ICL from across the state, we appreciate the fact that IDL and the land board, brought together this focus group. So first, it's an appreciation. I think we've had some good discussions, and I think that we as a state and as a land board and as IDL and as a community are richer because of it. So first, a heartfelt thank you to IDL and the land board for convening this, because I know that this isn't, necessarily how, it always, there's not always this opportunity for, sensing of public opinion. And so I do, truly appreciate that and understand that it's, arguably, well, it's clearly, it's not required at all. So I think a recognition of that. I think the, I guess, kind of echoing a number of the other comments that we've heard, that, we have held these lands in many cases for 131 years. And so let's not put an artificial timeline on this. And I know that IDL is operating on direction from the board to prepare this plan by date certain, but I am very hopeful and somewhat confident that the land board will not immediately approve that, finalize it, and move forward. I think that there is more discussion that is needed. And, I've gotten a few messages from focus group members, that I think there is an interest in continuing some of the discussions. And so, whether or not that is chartered in some way officially by IDL, or if members of the focus group are interested in coming together to see whether or not there is a joint statement or some joint input that we can come to consensus on and provide to the land board, I think that would be a very, very valuable process to engage in. And so I'm happy to, initiate that. If there's others in McCall that would like to help initiate that, I'm certainly eager and willing to help facilitate that discussion. My three main recommendations, though, to IDL, well, let me say before I talk about the specific recommendations, one, I just wanted to point to statement and the asset management policy and the asset management plan for IDL. Page 5 of that, where it talks about the asset management philosophy, it says specifically that we are going to consider the benefits and the returns on the investment as a whole trust, not on an individual parcel by parcel or acre by acre basis. That is, echoed very recently in the November 2020 strategic reinvestment policy that was approved by the board, that individual assets, and I'm quoting, individual assets must not be evaluated or must be evaluated not in isolation, but in the context of the whole trust. And so I think that those are a couple key management philosophies that are approved formal policy by the land board, that we're not going to do this kind of acre by acre splitting apart and say, okay, on this square foot, we don't have a lease, therefore we're going to sell it. But I understand at the end of the day, the land board needs to make decisions that are consistent with the best interest of the fiduciaries, but also, as Dave Simmons was mentioning, that there are other trust responsibilities that the state has, and recognizing some of the Supreme Court findings on fiduciary responsibility, understand that those are arguably elevated, but still must be considered in the context of these decisions. And then finally, the three primary recommendations would be: 1, slow down; 2, slow down; and 3, slow down. We have held these lands for 131 years. There is no reason that we must make a decision in the next 19 days on a final determination with regards to these lands. And I think, as I've said before, I think that the strategy really is more of a schedule for sale. The strategy does not step back and think about how do we find those win-win solutions. And I think we've heard time and again from the county, from the city, from local interests, that there are potential solutions here that can satisfy all interests, or at least seek to satisfy, in the words of Gifford Pinchot, the greatest good for the greatest number over the long term. So with that, again, appreciate the opportunity to participate and look forward to ongoing discussions.
Thanks, Jonathan. Julie, you're next. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you again for setting up this focus group and inviting us to participate. I've really enjoyed being a part of it and hearing all the great comments and the great work that the department is doing. I am here representing the Payette Endowment Lands Alliance. We've been receiving comments from our supporters and the members of a Facebook page run by one of our directors, which comprises nearly 2,500 people who care deeply about the McCall area endowment lands and are also concerned about statewide implications. When I looked at the comments that IDL has received so far, I noticed that a lot of them are coming in from people throughout the state. First, I'd like to highlight some of the general attributes that we really appreciate about the plan. First, it recognizes the importance of focusing on the McCall area. Second, it contemplates public input at various stages, including this one, so thank you again. Third, we appreciate the recognition of the substantial planning that the City of McCall and Valley County have already done. And the last thing is, I think by breaking this into tiers, it sort of implicitly recognizes that this area lacks the infrastructure and capacity to handle mass development all at once. Moving on, I'd like to say that any plan should rest on 2 foundations. One we've talked about a lot, it's the plan has to support the constitutional mandate to maximize returns over the long term. And if a plan does this, then it should be enforceable. And so I think we need to ensure that whatever is in this plan does accomplish that. And second, I think we need to recognize the central importance of Payette Lake. If the lake didn't exist, we wouldn't be here today. Also, as the governor has stated recently at the Water Quality Conference, Payette Lake is at the top of the ditch. Payette Lake affects water quality throughout the region, and we have to be vigilant about protecting it. In addition, I think it makes sense if the plan provides a predictable guide for future uses and of endowment lands and a framework to evaluate opportunities. This would make it easier for the public to make proposals that meet IDL standards and needs. And at the same time, it should reduce confusion and litigation risk. I think all this can be achieved, and I would recommend using the PELS as a starting point and convening a longer-term advisory board that could do a comprehensive and cumulative analysis that considers critical factors in the context of McCall endowment lands, including the following, and I'm just going to state a few. First, McCall is central to the large and growing recreation economy in Idaho, and this could provide a lot of revenues and a lot of returns. Second, let's consider the endowment lands in the context of Ponderosa Park and the Payette National Forest. What is the value of maintaining these continuous areas of forest and park? And what about the wildland urban interface and the fire risks that are so key, especially on the parcels that are set out in the PELS right now? And a third critical factor is infrastructure, including sewers and roads. What can feasibly be added to support any future development and at what cost? The final factor, but definitely not the least, is keeping in mind that the state would acting as a good neighbor, because we all recognize the critical importance of preserving the health and existence of the McCall community for its residents and for visitors from the Treasure Valley and beyond. What we would recommend is continuing the excellent efforts that have begun here, and let's roll up our sleeves so that we can collaborate to find and realize the valuable overlaps between the needs of McCall, Valley County, and the endowment beneficiaries. We know that the overlaps are there, and working together, we think we can find this win-win for all Idahoans. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Kristen, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Scott. And again, like everyone, thank you for the participation on this panel. I want to, I guess, start by, again, saying what's good in this plan. And what we believe is good in it is it's a really good starting point within the current constraints that exist on staff. I think it's good that the staff looked at the Valley County and McCall plans and asked for the focus group input, and also considered the Whitefish Comprehensive Plan at one point in time. What's missing, and I looked through all of the comments that are coming into the website, the IDL website, and there's a lot of them, and it echoes everything that everyone is saying here. And I want to make sure that the attendees that are listening know that we are listening to you. But what's missing really is the bigger picture and vision for the bigger plan, building a plan that incorporates acreage around the lake so that the people of this area can make long-term decisions on how the infrastructure needs to be built out. And there's just so many issues surrounding that. One of the things that I've heard across everybody, and I agree with, is that the protocol and guides and process for the staff and citizens need to be built so that we can all rely on those and reduce the headaches for the staff and increase the reduce the frustration for the citizens that are trying to go after applications and easements. So really just refining that process. I think Clive and Craig and others all talked about that. Big thing is the water and protection of that. I think Dave did a nice job of outlining that. And really what we'd like to see, echoing what Jonathan said, is slow this process down. Develop that long-term stakeholder advisory group and look at what our neighbors in Montana have done. Utilize the structure that they had built for what the Whitefish plan, so it wouldn't take as long as what they had done. And I know that I've heard, we have different constitution than, or they have different rules in Montana than we do here. I came across really what the difference is. And Article 9 of Montana's Constitution which was redone in 1972 at their Constitution Convention, charges the state government with protecting and enhancing the inalienable right of all Montanans to a clean and healthful environment. The combination of this constitutional right with the state's well-established rules and duties to manage the grant of lands as a trust has shaped Montana's approach to trust land management. That's what we need. We need something, and I know that would take a long time and process, but in order to stop the headaches of this whole process going forward, we need a constitution change. And that's where we get to the win-win for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Michelle, you're up next, please.
Okay, thanks. Nothing like being towards the end of a really large group. Anyways, I think Annette spoke to some of the higher level comments from the city so far, but as the Community and Economic Development Director for the McCall area, which includes the city and the impact area, one of the things that I felt could be stronger in the plan was more emphasis on the vision of the McCall area and what the community has really said are the goals and objectives. So I think you know, in the last 15 years or so, we've done a lot of planning with our community, so much so that a consultant once said, we have a community of 3,000 planners, and IDL is probably feeling that now. But anyway, I think our public's really used to being very engaged in the process. So I think that if this plan is building upon the work that's already been done, I think it'll be more widely accepted. There'll be less noise and probably more successful in the long haul. So I think there's a benefit in utilizing some of the work that's already been done. One of the things I noticed in reviewing the draft is it feels like the strategy is really focused at or on transitioning lands to residential, or at least mostly residential development. So I felt like this group provided a lot of really good input on adding different uses that could be incorporated in that, hopefully the next draft of the plan. And I do have quite a few comments and edits that I'll get to the staff related to basically like how the impact area works. There were some errors in the zoning and the land use designations. And then lastly, I think one thing that hasn't come up a lot in this group is considering things like infrastructure such as sewer capacity. I mean, sewer capacity really drives the density and development right now in the community. So I think that's a really important thing to consider in the analysis portion of this plan. So what is right? Well, I think considering input from this group, the planning, and then just general public comment always makes a stronger plan. So I think that's really great. And then also getting into the specifics, I do think considering the state 80 that's located on Dinehard, and thinking about that as sort of a first step in terms of maybe liquidating assets is a good one because it's consistent with our planning and there's already infrastructure there. Whereas some of these more sensitive areas around the lake, I think they're better off pushed to the future. So more work can be done on trying to figure out how to better realize, I think, the vision of the community, which isn't necessarily residential development all the way around the lake.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Michelle.
Thank you.
Nick, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I wanted to say thank you to the IDL for being so highly collaborative in this whole process. Second, I think I just kind of sat back and thought for a second, you know, since these lands were gifted over and endowed in 1890, just thinking about all of the material changes that have happened in our state, the amazing growth, the change, and the fact that we're sitting here discussing what to do ostensibly with up to 2.5 million in undeveloped land is not a problem that a number of our states in this great country have. And it's a good problem to have. So kudos to the IDL for having preserved that and achieved that high level return. Having said that, we are going through a pretty accelerated rate of change, both in terms of our economy and also our growth as a state. And I do think it's time to start thinking about new solutions. In some ways, we've reached kind of a critical tipping point. And, I will say that having gone through this, and a number of my colleagues have echoed the same thing, there is this kind of inflated sense of urgency to come up with a solution right now. And I think, the reality is that it behooves us to slow down on a lot of different levels. Because we're going through these changes and it requires a new solution, that takes thought and that takes time. And ironically, it's also a good economic outcome to slow down for the beneficiaries of the trust. These are precious lands. They are appreciating in value, and slowing down a little bit is a good economic outcome for them. And I think that's important, for the IDL to realize. I think, we do need to develop a better long-term strategy. That's important, and it needs to be comprehensive and probably also larger in scope than the 5,000 acre parcel that's currently being considered. And I think that longer term problem needs to solve, or longer term solution needs to solve a problem. And that problem is these are highly appreciated assets that are rapidly appreciating. That's a difficult value for the IDL to monetize. And I think we need to come up with a solution that does that. And the way we do that is we map out our stakeholders, all those that benefit from these lands beyond just the beneficiary holders. And that would include environmental interests, the city of McCall, Valley County, business owners who benefit from increased, foot traffic, recreational users, and also the state of Idaho, right? I mean, there is a reason why people are moving to Idaho, and it's because we have such amazing resources, not the least of which are probably highest on the list is our land, our open land. And so that results in higher growth and therefore higher tax receipts to the state. And I think there is a solution, right, where we can develop sort of a quilted strategy to achieving some threshold level of return that extracts that appreciation value over time. If you've got an asset that's appreciating like this, and you're able to gather, say, 2% of it a year, that 2% return grows and grows and grows and grows and grows over time. And it allows you to monetize that appreciation. And I think that's the solution. That's the win-win. Look, at the end of the day, complex solutions require time, they require thought, and they require collaboration, and they require creativity to come to a good solution. And I think, the biggest thing we need to do right now, as Jonathan said, is we need to slow down. And that's a good economic outcome. Slow down, give it thought, put all the parties together, and come up with a good solution.
Right. Thanks, Nick. Robert, are you still with us?
I'm still here.
There you are. Floor is yours.
Yeah, the snow stakes at 7 inches, guys. So I'll try not to get over my skis here on this, but wow, it is just dumping out my window here, and it just makes me love being here in Idaho all again. So anyhow, great for putting this together. Ryan, thank you and your team for putting that plan together and including us. I'm fortunate to be part of this, what I think is a pretty impressive panel. Boy, what a diverse group you put together here, and you got a lot of interest. And I think the best thing that came out of the plan was this process right here. And I think you're going to be asked to opine on that in front of the IDL. And I hope that what you take away from this and is an opportunity that the IDL staff has not really had. And that opportunity is that you are unconstrained in process. And you can go back to the IDL and say, this is a pain in the ass. Sorry, we had to go through all this with these guys. We just did it. We checked the box, and this is just like all the other ones. Or you can go back and you can be creative, and you can actually, as part of the plan, you could put together a process that moves this forward. And I think nothing other than what Craig said, and I'm gonna go off of that experience that he had. The first thing that happened on that was the relationship with the stakeholders. You improved relationship with every stakeholder that you had into here. what happened with that? What happened with that relationship with the stakeholders? You created value because you started the dialogue and you started to create opportunities on how you could create and maximize value for the land. And so we have an example of this process that you started right here that's going to yield you a proposal on a conservation easement that's likely going to give you some monetary value. And if you continue this process and you capture it and you create it so that you can manage this process and repeat it, you're going to be more successful and you're going to create more opportunities and more monetization and more collaboration, and you're going to get more support. And politically, it's going to be a great thing for you guys. And so I'm suggesting, and I'm going to read my suggestion here after I get off my soapbox, but I'm suggesting that you guys take this opportunity right now that you have to put together a long-lasting process. And I would just succinctly say that you should establish for us the Payette Endowment Land Advisory Committee, led by IDL. PLAC would work with IDL to secure comments from stakeholders and the local community, as well as develop recommendations to meet the statutory requirements and constraints governing the management of state endowment lands. And if you continue on with this process as part of your recommendation for the plan, you're going to yield greater value on all these lands, I guarantee you. So that's my first comment to process. Let me shift over now to the comments on the plan. I'm going to read that first, and then I've got some ideas for you on that. Everybody said this, I'm going to re-say it again. You need to build a comprehensive vision plan. You cannot go forward with a plan that's incremental in nature that only includes the McCall impact area. And that plan should include the entire timber acreage around the Payette Endowment Lands. The plan is currently incomplete because it only identifies as those land in transition in the impact zone. And your land exchanges that you have opportunities to are unconstrained to that area, correct? So what you're building by not including the other parcels on this, what you're building is a trap door for everything to fall in through here. You have focused everybody's attention on what you may do within 5,000 acres of property in through here. And you have not focused on the other remaining property for which in front of you, you have a proposal for an exchange. So now you haven't moved forward in this plan to build a framework from which you can actually evaluate such a plan from Trident or other folks that might bring this in by only focusing on the endowment lands. And actually you sold everything short by only focusing on those lands, and this is what you have a plan on. You need to expand this from a comprehensive basis. It has to be for the entire land surround. And one of the recommendations should be, hey, this is what you were directed to do. This is what Ryan was told to do, and this is what he did. But this is the starting point from which you now need to build the full plan out for the lands before you take action going forward. And you need to embrace some of these concepts relative to conservation easements in that overall plan, and you'll be better off for it. A couple other quick comments that don't fall anywhere. And the first one is, it's really hard if IDL thinks that they can actually take the land surrounding Payette Lake and take an action that would lead to the degradation of the lake quality, right? That is inconsistent with and inherently a conflict that it may not be distinctly called out in the Constitution, but that can't happen, right? And so there needs to be a resolution for that. And what the other 6 states around us have done, other than Idaho, is they've addressed that type of conflict they had through some state process, some conservation, some other process, so that they don't end up in this conflict of trying to figure out how, hey, that's not our mandate. So ultimately, this leads to a relook at the constitutional directive that's been given you guys and the board of how to dispose of land, because we have this inherent conflict. And boy, this is one place in the state where it's just, really focused. And so I think it leads to that. So that's all in there.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Tara, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Scott. Well, like everyone, thanks for the opportunity to participate. I think I've learned quite a bit. I thought I understood the IDL's mandate pretty well, but I am thoroughly educated at this point. So I appreciate the opportunity. And I'm impressed with how well a lot of the panelists have articulated what they're thinking. I hope I hope what I have to say is also helpful, but probably not as articulate. I guess, first of all, Michelle kind of stole my thunder, but what I really wanted to point out was how good of a process the city of McCall and Valley County had put together for their comprehensive plan, and kind of spending some time on that after the meeting. Well, here you have apparently an award-winning public input process and planning process that I think is recognized in the current plan, but maybe needs a little more emphasis, that they have, thoroughly vetted some of those ideas. And I think you can use that as sort of a starting point where it's appropriate, and on certain parcels that obviously are included in that plan as well. So I guess I just reiterate Michelle's comments that should be a big part of how you go forward with some of those parcels. And then as far as the plan itself, I think it's a good land management plan. I think there's certainly more detail that could be added, but as far as the phased timeline approach, I think I get that. I think I understand sort of the intent there, and I support that. It gives the department, regardless of who's sort of at the helm, guidance on how to move forward in that area, which is kind of the intent of having a specific management plan. But there's also quite a bit of flexibility. I think you probably could, it does come across a little bit as a planned approach for disposal, but I don't think that was really the intent. I think it was more to give the department time to evaluate individual parcels and sort of grow with the city of McCall and Payette Lake. So I do like the phased approach. I can't really comment on whether what's included in individual buckets is the right mix necessarily, since we haven't looked at those individual parcels, but the overall concept I think is good. As far as like concerns, I think my concern is more on the bigger picture. I think this plan will ultimately set precedents statewide. And I think that deserves a lot of consideration. And I think where I'm going with that, and other people have certainly asked the right questions on some of those concerns, but it's the concept of the individual parcels underperforming, but the metrics for that and the ability to only look at certain revenue streams doesn't quite add up. And I think it actually is going to open the floodgates if that's the precedence that we set statewide. Just as an example, market value of timberland changes over time pretty drastically. And even if you were to look at any set of current timberlands, whether they're solidly productive timberlands or not, if they're anywhere near a road right now, their value is probably higher as recreational property than it is as timberland. And so I think setting a precedence where, sort of this time relevant underperforming concept being the driver for identifying parcels that maybe transition, it is a little bit dangerous, especially given some of the concerns about how we evaluate revenue generation and not being able to monetize other types of values beyond just timber value or maybe even a conservation easement. So, I don't have a solution there. I'd like to offer one, but I just think that it's going to cause problems, I guess. And so I guess, Jonathan could probably quote the language again for us, but I think the intent is to keep endowment lands as working forests and keep the endowment whole. So I think just that whole concept of underperformance might undermine that, or at least make the department's job more difficult and more proposals coming in as parcels become more valuable as something other than timberland. So I guess that's more of a broad brush concern. But otherwise, I thought the plan was really good. The last meeting, I thought Mr. Utter's his conversation about the conservation easements as an option, just was really encouraging as far as the opportunity to find a win-win in all of this, even given some of the complications that we've obviously identified. So that's it. Thank you guys. Appreciate it. It's nice to meet all of you for sure.
Thank you, Tara. You were the last person on the list to provide 5 minutes of comments. But before we move on to item number C on the agenda, I just want to recognize some of the other folks that have tuned in for today's meeting and the other meetings as well. Someone had mentioned earlier that they were pleased to have the opportunity to speak directly to IDL's top executive staff. I'm personally pleased that representatives of all of our bosses, the land board members, have also tuned in to listen to what you have to say, your concerns, thoughts, ideas, hopes, and suggestions. So I'd like to recognize from the superintendent's office, Carly Bennett, from the governor's office, Nate Fisher Jr., Secretary of State, we heard from Chad Hauk earlier, State Controller's office, Brian Benjamin, and from the Attorney General's office, Angela Kaufman. Really appreciate their support in this project and the fact that they are here to listen to you. So that's a wonderful thing. Sid, we're on track for 4 o'clock completion. It's up to you to take us into item number C and explain the comment submissions process, please.
Absolutely. And first, I just want to also thank everyone here for your thoughts, your comments, and your time. It truly is a testament to your commitment. Just really nothing new from me. Stuff you've already heard. A comment submission date, March 1st. Please have those submitted by the end of the day. We look forward to reviewing your written comments. I've heard that there are those that are interested in collaborating and submitting a joint submission. That's fine. You're welcome to work that out. We're not going to try and coordinate that. But I do want to be clear that please don't just submit the comments that you all agree on. We're hoping to hear all of your ideas and comments you have. As diverse and different as they may be, that's what we're really looking for. Once we've received those comments, all of the comments will be given to the board, but we'll also compile a summary of those comments that will be presented to the board. We'll also go through our plan and make modifications that we can to the plan based on the comments that, as long as those comments comport and conform to the rules and laws that we've already reviewed with you. We certainly have heard a lot about time and timing and the pace and, time to develop and, improve the strategies. And I just want to, reemphasize that the plan really doesn't determine or limit the use of any of the sites. This really isn't deciding the fate at this time. This is really kind of a schedule for the sites the sites will be dealt with. And that's where, we're hoping that you guys can come up with you or the community or your groups can come up with plans and proposals to help, those are the strategies that I think that everybody wants to talk about, and that's after this plan. That's really all I have. I believe we were going to give the director a little bit of time.
On a final note, Sid, would you kind of cover what to expect on the 16th of March when the land board meets? What will that process kind of look and feel like?
Certainly, I don't know if those that have attended or watched land board meetings in the past, but it'll run just in line with all the other meetings. There will be a presentation that the department gives, presenting a land board memo. The memo will, as part of that, will include the attachments, which will be all of the comments that were submitted, both by you as well as all of the public, as well as the summary that we put together, along with the revised plan that we've completed, and then a recommendation by the department, and then the board will then deliberate on that.
Great. Thank you, Sid. And I'm going to kind of take off my IDL hat for a moment and put on a hat that I used to wear as a land board staffer. And I can't emphasize just how important these comments are to the board. When they ask for a comment, in my experience, it means they're interested, they're engaged. It's gonna help shape their thinking on things. So just want to get back to that deadline and the process for getting your comments in. Please be thorough. What we really want is a breadth of ideas that will really help pollinate a good outcome that looks for the beneficiaries' needs. And like the director had said at the last meeting, can create a win-win for everyone involved in this process. Now we're at the end of our agenda, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask one other person just to say a couple words, and that's Director Miller. He had mentioned he wanted to say a few things. So, sir, the floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, Scott, and everybody. I can't see everybody right now since the agenda is up. If you take that down, I'm using my iPad because my laptop doesn't seem to be working properly. So, I just think it's great that we were able to, have this time together, these 3 meetings together. It's a lot of time out of everybody's schedule to commit. But like I said at a previous meeting, transparency is important to me. It's important to this agency, the employees at IDL, and it's very important for the land board. You've heard about the issues, about our mission, the box we have to work in, our mandates, our processes, the fiduciary responsibility of the land board. It's a lot, it's complex, but our mandate is clear. These endowment lands are just that. They're endowment trust lands, owned for the beneficiaries. We manage those lands for a specific purpose for those beneficiaries, but the public has the luxury of using these lands. And these lands I know are important to the community of McCall and a lot of folks that recreate in the area. So our management certainly gets a little more complex in areas around McCall. As I have to laugh and Jonathan, I appreciate your Gifford Pinchot quote. I admire the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service. But I will point out in our annual report, Scott's team has put in here, and I'll get you a free copy, Jonathan. The explanation of the mission of the Idaho Department of Lands, the Forest Service, BLM, and Idaho Parks and Recreation. And I just say that jokingly because you used the quote for the Forest Service, and the example I used earlier on was pulling up in an IDL pickup to a service station in McCall, and somebody commenting to me that their father also used to work for the U.S. Forest Service. But anyways, it's sort of a constant thing that we need to do, given the way this state has changed and people moving here, the way Boise has grown, the way the community of McCall has grown. It's sort of a constant educational campaign for us to inform people of who we are and what we do. And so these processes are unique. They're complicated. And this plan has been important for us to put together, to examine different options here, to really look closely at some of these lands where we're not hitting the mark on, we're not hitting our revenue goals. In the uplands, I know there's been a lot of talk about the other acreage around the lake that IDL manages for the endowment beneficiaries. And a lot of those places we are hitting the mark. And much of that ground, which is classified as timberland, is managed under different management plans. Jim Elbin explained our forest asset management plan. But while this is a challenging situation, it's complicated, it's also an opportunity. It's been a great opportunity to meet you all, to share information, to help inform community leaders like yourselves of our endowment mission, what we're obligated to do, and really what some of our challenges are on some of these lands around McCall. But like I said, an opportunity here to see what other types of activities and proposals could come into the department to where we can close that revenue gap. We can have big wins for our endowment beneficiaries, but also look for opportunities for the public to also win here. So the endowment beneficiaries have to win. But again, if we can look at some of those win-win opportunities, I'm all in for exploring that. So again, thank you all for participating. I appreciate the time that you spent with us. Robert, I'm a little jealous that you're in the McCall area and you say there's about 7 inches of new snow. I'm almost chewing on the furniture here, getting excited to go skiing this weekend. But anyways, with that, Scott, I'll kick it back to you. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to get to know you all.
Thanks, Dustin. And just to clarify with your comment submission, you're welcome to use the online form on our Payette Endowment Land Strategy webpage. Alternatively, if you have a document to submit as part of your comments, you're welcome to email it to Tammy Armstrong. That's tarmstrong@idl.idaho.gov. So that concludes today's meeting. To our focus group participants, thank you for your time and attention. And to everyone else who logged in to join us today, we had at one point 73 people logged into this meeting. Thank you for your interest as well. And everyone have a wonderful and safe afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you.